There is a commonly believed story in Australia that concerns a paper compass. So the story goes, in the first years of Australia being a British colony, a group of 21 Irish convicts, including one pregnant woman, decided they were going to take off, escape their sentences, and walk their way north to China, a place they believed was easily accessible by foot from Sydney. To anyone with access to a map, this is obviously a journey that's not going to work. Especially not when you're walking with a group of 20 other convicts through territory completely foreign to you, scant provisions over your shoulder, in the late 1700s, oh, and none of you have a ship. Regardless, they set off with sure feet and determination, unswayed by doubt and derision, hiking through the thick Australian bush. And one of them had the most perfect method to navigate to China, a drawing of a compass on a piece of paper. See, it did point north. The needle, in fact, did a fantastic job of pointing north. It just only showed the actual north if you pointed the piece of paper that way. Shockingly, they didn't make it to China. Who'd have thought? The furthest they got was to Broken Bay, on the Hawkesbury River, which in fairness to them is north from the place they set off from. At least a couple died along the way, of misadventure or perhaps by spear. The rest were driven back to the settlement in Parramatta, near Sydney, by starvation. It's a ridiculous story, but one that fits so well into the completely ridiculous disaster that was the beginning of the invasion of a colony at Sydney. It's a story that was popularized in modern day by David Hunt in his 2013 book, Gert. Thing is, despite what Hunt wrote in that book, there's no evidence there ever was a paper compass. None until a couple of months ago, that I'd been able to find anyway. Interested, I looked up the story after reading it in his book. I found Watkin Tench's journals of the early colony in Australia and read them. In A Complete Account of the Settlement at Port Jackson, published in 1793, Watkin Tench does chronicle this story of the hopeful travelers to China, to the detail, except for the part about the paper compass. As far as I could tell, there was no paper compass. And from what I found, Gert got the date wrong too. The travelers to China had their misadventure in November 1791, not 1792. But my nitpicking aside, I'd found zero evidence of the paper compass that adds such great flair to the story. Until a couple of months ago. Because a couple of months ago, I jumped to catch a piece of paper, blown by the wind. It was a very old piece of paper. Small, about the size of my palm, though thicker than today's paper. Badly yellowed, repeatedly crumpled and smoothed. Little holes worn into it, rain damaged and faded. The drawing on it was done in pencil with the lines so reinforced by tracing over them again and again with the lead, I could still make out, the page tilted into the sunlight, a faint outline of a compass drawn with a needle that pointed north. That was at the time proof of nothing. Someone more recently than 1791 could have drawn it, and it just looked over 200 years old. But it stirred my curiosity. Partly because where this paper compass blew to me was very near the furthest north the doomed travelers to China were known to have reached. Pindar Cave in the Brisbane Water National Park. This part of the national park sits on a peninsula between Mooney Mooney and Mullet Creeks, both of which feed at the tip of the peninsula straight into the Hawkesbury River, and just east of that is Broken Bay. Pindar Cave is less a cave and more a spectacular overhang of rock loads of people can camp together under, enjoying its shelter after a long bushwalk. A refreshing waterfall tinkles nearby, perfect to douse your sweaty head or refill your water bottle if you got desperate and ran out. I'd been sitting for a breather there in the overhang's shade, taking in the tranquil surroundings and bird call of the Australian bush, when the fluttering of the paper compass caught the light in the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was the scuttling of a lizard I'd been watching a moment before, but the lizard was still there, in the same place basking in the sun. The paper was blowing through the air and into the short scrub before it. Jumping up, I caught the piece of paper, only slightly startling the sun-bathing goanna. I'd been annoyed, before I looked at the paper, about people littering in the park. After I looked at it, seeing how old it appeared, and making out the faint impression of a compass, the wheels of imagination in my head started turning. Maybe it was just that overactive imagination, my curiosity. But looking up from the page to stare back at Pindar Cave, I could almost see 21 18th century travelers destined for China camped under it. It'd be a great spot for it, even over 200 years ago. The overhang and waterfall would have been there for them, just as it was here for me now. Tired and hungry travelers sprawled on the ground, their shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, the one pregnant woman huffing and leaning back against a rock, skirts tied up in the slowly diminishing heat of the evening, as the men in tweed trousers looked to build a fire on the orange dirt floor under the overhang. At the time, it was just something I wanted to think about. Like how visiting what remained of the first highway that led north from Sydney, I'd stood on that rough-hewn road and thought I could imagine all the convicts who'd built it, cutting into that rock by hand, mused over whether any of those convicts were my own ancestors. I liked the idea, looking at Pindar Cave, the paper compass in my hand, that the travelers on their ludicrous quest to China had actually made it this far, and spent the night here. And I got a flash, gazing at the shaded space under the overhang, of what that would have been like for those convicts who lived centuries ago, transported so far from their Irish homes, out, lost far into the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but wilderness, nothing they recognized. Indigenous people who rightly felt their homelands were being stolen, and not even a map to guide them. The only European settlement that had back then existed all the way back near Sydney. I tucked the paper compass into my backpack, being careful not to crumple or crease it any more than it had already been, and took it with me, hiking through the bush, back towards the old Wandabine quarry, and the train station built to service it, my route home. A route home was so much easier in today's world, where I could snooze on a train as it took me south, and I had the path back to the railway both tramped into the ground and tracked by GPS on my phone. I worked out who the leader of the travelers to China was. His name was Peter Malone, and the pregnant woman who'd traveled north with him was his wife, Mary. Luckily for them, she was transported to Australia on a later ship, rather than imprisoned in those Fair and Emerald Isles, or transported elsewhere. I figured this out from the names written on the back of the paper compass. Peter and Mary Malone was scrawled, barely visible, in faint charcoal on the reverse. Something I only noticed when I got home, and took it out of my backpack. Again, it could have been someone far more recent than 1791 who'd drawn the compass, who'd written those names. But I looked up those names. I bought a membership to a genealogy website and searched. I found the ship's manifest that listed the early convicts transported to Australia. And Peter and Mary Malone were on them. Mary, not Peter, was listed on the sick list for the Rose Hill Tent Hospital in November 1791. She wasn't there because of the dysentery that had struck down over 300 convict settlers, however. She was there because of a festering wound to her leg, gained in, as the records state, an escape attempt. To China, I'm assuming. There is no further record of Peter, other than the end of a sentence recorded in the old logs. Not as sentence served, but as deceased. I don't think Peter, like Mary, made it back from their 1791 ill-fated voyage north. From what I found in British records, Peter had been found guilty of the theft of one handkerchief from the owner of a jewelry store. That was his crime, why he was transported to Australia as a convict. Mary, a week after Peter's crime, had stolen a loaf of bread. Due to the long length of time between Peter's transport and Mary's arrival in the convict colony, I must assume she became pregnant in Australia, so I don't think that bread was to feed too. But it just sounds like she was trying, in a poverty-stricken state without her husband, to not starve. And she was caught, found guilty, and transported to the other side of the world for that one loaf of bread. In those days, possibly somewhat more than it is true to say now, the word convict was a synonym for the words poor and starving. It was the day after I found that out, having passed out in my bed after searching genealogy sites late into the night, that I woke up to notice the paper compass, which I'd left on my desk beside my computer, was pointing north. Not just that the needle, drawn to always point that way, was pointed towards the N. I mean, the entire piece of paper had spun around and was now accurately pointing north. I was sure before I'd passed out, I left it oriented upright beside my computer. That orientation would have left the needle pointing southeast. You know how you like the idea of something, but don't really believe it? Standing next to my desk looking at the paper compass, that was me. It was a cool idea to think a paper compass could actually point north. But it was so much more likely that I just brushed it when I closed my laptop the night before. I righted the paper, got myself ready for work, and left for the day. And when I came home, well, the idea not only seemed cooler, but it also sent tingles down my spine. Because the paper was, once again, spun around to point toward my computer mouse. Due north. I shivered, went to write the piece of paper, then stopped. Instead, I double-checked with the map on my phone, making absolutely sure that the needle was pointing north. Conferring with the road out my window, and some turning around in circles while muttering to myself, and I was sure of it. Yep, due north. I'm guessing there are ways a piece of paper can be rigged to spin around on its own in order to point north. But, inspecting the paper compass, there was nothing added to it. There wasn't even enough pencil lead on it for it to be somehow magnetized. It was just a bedraggled and rather floppy piece of paper. I righted the paper and watched TV that night. Getting up to go to bed, my eyes darted back over to the paper compass. It had spun around again. Due frickin' north. A new wave of chills ran down my spine. I hovered beside it, then braced myself and righted the compass yet again. It seemed the paper had gotten bolder. Right there in front of me, under my gaze, the thing, flat on the wood of my desk, started to move. I watched it shift slowly sideways, then pick up a bit of speed, the ratty old paper rotating on its own. It stopped, pointing as it had done multiple times before, right at my mouse. North. I shuddered, then sighed out what felt like a cold breath. Maybe it was the lateness of the hour, but the whole thing felt incredibly spooky. One of those things that's just otherworldly. My eyes prickled with weird tears I hadn't expected, as a new wave of chilled tingles ran through my body. How was it doing that? Just to spite it, or myself, I turned the compass back the right way up, then waited. The light sound of paper slipping over wood, the revolving of that drawn needle. It did it again. That is creepy as hell, I told the paper, for my own benefit. Shuddered, then went to my bedroom and, feeling the inexplicable need on this night, shut the door. I didn't sleep well that night, and the only conclusion I came to over the night was to decide to head back to Wandabine on the weekend, taking the compass with me. That was where I'd found it, at Pindar Cave. So it seemed like a good place to start. What I was starting, I had no idea. But a paper compass that actually worked was remarkable enough that I wanted to look into it. Wandabine train station is the only train station in Australia that has no road access. To get to it, you can go by boat, which the few people who live over Mullet Creek from it do. By foot, but that's a long walk from the nearest road, and by train. By train, you must let the train guard know you want to alight at Wandabine, otherwise it doesn't stop there. And you must be in the last carriage of the train because the platform is so short, it only fits one train carriage. It was first opened in 1889 for the sake of both connecting a rail line from Sydney to Brisbane and to service the quarry that supplied the sandstone used in the construction of a good number of the old buildings in Sydney. Only an hour and a half's train ride out of Sydney's city centre, the station today is mostly used by bushwalkers, like me. My hand resting over where I'd slipped the compass into my bag, I gazed out the window as the train trundled steadily north, passing into the expanse of the national park that must look now just like it had 200 years ago. The main difference is, though, that instead of the bush outside the window being endless, the national park now is just an admittedly large green space between many different towns and sprawling suburbs. It still feels like you're traveling into some great wilderness, though, despite the inane graffiti scratched into the train window. The train trundled to a stop, and I disembarked the last carriage onto the short Wandabine platform. The doors shut, and the train started up again, its yellow and gray livery snaking away north beside the glistening river until it wound behind a steep and rocky hill and disappeared from sight. It left me behind, alone on the train platform. Though I'd been here several times before, I looked around with what felt like fresh eyes. Wandabine train station may have first opened in the late 1800s, but it's been renovated since then. Modern down to the electronic train card readers and emergency help point, it's incongruous in the idyllic and ancient valley. Just this small, weirdly modern train platform, sitting here in the apparent middle of nowhere. To one side of the train line is Mullet Creek, better called a river. To the other, the sandstone quarry is sliced into the rocks, half hidden by bush. There's a small jetty that pokes out into the river. No boats are tied to it today. And over the river, I could just see the several fishing boats and cottages of the people who live there, very much off the grid. As they'd have no road access either, no street addresses. I'd long imagined they'd built those houses themselves, and done so to get away from the rest of society. For a moment I wondered about that. What would make someone want to live out here? And if they had no road access, how did they get their rubbish collected? Then I shook myself and squatted down. Slipping from my bag, the folder I'd protected the paper compass in, I fetched out the bedraggled paper and laid it on the concrete platform. This was as far as I'd developed my plan, so I watched that paper compass with an eagle eye, hoping it'd do something. I'd expected it'd just point north. That alone would convince me in the light of day that I wasn't a nutcase with a paper compass. The paper seemed to rustle on the platform, like it was shivering. Somewhere between skepticism and belief, I noted the light breeze against my skin. I leaned down, curling myself over the compass, and did my best to shield it from the wind. Looking under myself, I eyed the compass for movement. Though the breeze didn't get any stronger, I felt it like a sudden cold chill that ran down my spine. Like each of the times over the week I'd seen the compass move. The paper shivered. And it couldn't be because of the breeze now. Maybe it only worked on my wooden desk? Or... Feeling like an idiot, I noted the rough platform surface under my hands. Grabbing the plastic folder I'd brought the compass in, I set that on the floor and put the compass on top of its slippery surface. Once again, shielding the compass from the breeze, I waited, watching. And slowly it did as it had done back at home. It twisted, rotating around all on its own, and came to a stop. My eyes prickled with tears again as yet another shiver went down my spine. Blinking my eyes clear, I fished out my phone, now equipped with a handy compass app, and checked. North. But this time not due north. I frowned, comparing the faint drawing of a needle to the one on my phone. The paper compass was now pointing north-northeast. I packed back up and stood. Well, north-northeast then, I figured logically. If I was here to investigate a paper compass, I might as well follow its direction. How would I get north-northeast though? The trail from the station, the one I'd taken to Pindar Cave, led northwest, with the closest intersecting trail I knew of leading southwest. In the direction the compass had pointed was a rail line, and I wasn't so sure I wanted to walk along the tracks. Deciding I'd look for a trail that led north off the main one, I started off that way, headed for the steps up around the old quarry. Standing sentry above the tall, man-made cliffs of the abandoned quarry is an old steam crane, just left there for over a century. It feels like the mascot of Wandabine Quarry, rusted and majestic, right at the edge of rock walls, discolored by years of leaching rainwater. As I had on my trek to Pindar Cave, I detoured from the route, following an informal trail a short way to be able to look out over the quarry through the chain-link fence that keeps people from the dangerous edge. There, able to see further on higher ground, I pulled out the paper compass again and set it up on its folder as level as I could on the rocky path. It was still for a second, then the chill once again going down my spine. It rotated around and pointed, me looking at it across the deep gorge of the quarry, straight at the old steam crane. Still north-northeast. And now, it looked to me that it was the steam crane the compass was leading me to. If there was some old mystery here at Wandabine, I thought that the steam crane wasn't a bad location for it. Maybe there was a reason it had never been removed from the site, other than the fact that it was a huge steel beast. Surely it no longer worked, but getting to it didn't prove easy. Many false turns, trekking far off the trail, and watching for treacherous footing took up my afternoon, the hours trickling by as I sought a way to walk in the direction the paper compass had indicated. I was starting to lose enthusiasm for my self-imposed task, the wonder of the compass being forgotten in the heat and sweat, when I found a place I could sneak under the chain-link fence. A place not far from that rusted beast that had watched over the quarry since the first stones were cut here. It was getting worryingly late, considering I still had to find my way back, but I walked out, skirting the edge of that stone hole as the sun just started to change to that dimmer color that meant it was threatening to set. The quarry at the edge of its carved hole is a magnificent place. I felt suddenly tiny there, a speck in a grand landscape filled with silent history, the laughter of kookaburras heralding the coming darkness, singing out through the valley. Bleak and ugly, yes, the quarry was, but in a wondrous way. The base of it, a dizzying distance below my feet, was dotted with machinery in varying levels of rust and disuse. I made my way carefully around the steep edge of the quarry, the steam crane starting to loom, a forgotten technology over me. Rust brown, crafted in steel beams and massive gears. The operation of the crane was unknowable to me. I didn't get too near. The bush had grown up around and inside the crane's stance on the very edge of the quarry's sheer cliff. Fear of somehow getting hurt by the thing or disturbing it in some way had me stopping a meter from it. I found a flat spot of dirt beside the crane and set up the paper compass. The wind had picked up, but shielded by the scrubs, only one corner of the compass fluttered. Undaunted, it started to revolve. I watched it turn, feeling like I was in some surreal other world alone out here, and then pinned it to the plastic folder when it stopped. The crane was right before me, but the compass wasn't pointing at it. It had spun around to continue to point north-northeast. I think it was disappointment this time that prickled my eyes with light tears. That and the chill that caught me every time the impossible compass moved. Not here then? I breathed to the compass. Almost like an answer, a tussle of wind snaked around me, lifting my hair and fluttering the edges of the compass. Well, that was all I could do for today. I'd followed one lead and found nothing. I'd better head home before the sun went down. I wasn't even sure the train driver would be able to see me madly waving for him to stop in the dark, and that was how I'd get home. By unceremoniously flagging down a train on the least used platform in Australia. Sunrise is better. I was startled, for some reason thinking to snatch up the compass and fold it protectively as I spun around. The compass clutched close against my chest. I stared at where a man, someone I hadn't noticed at all, was sitting barely a meter from the edge of the quarry, just his balding head visible over the long grass and scrub. He was only a few meters away from me, and I hadn't even heard him. Hadn't caught even a hint of his presence. And I would have walked right past him. "What are you doing here?" I uttered, admittedly really freaked out. Unaffected, the man glanced over at me. He took a moment to reply. "Could ask the same of you, love." He watched me a moment longer, then pointed over the deep pit of the quarry. "That's east," he said shortly. "Sunrise is better. You can't see the sunset from here." My mind racing, I stepped cautiously towards him, grabbing up my bag and swinging it over my shoulder, the compass still clutched to my chest. I figured the man was one of the people who lived over the river, a fisherman off the grid. He looked to fit the mold. Perhaps in his late 50s, his well-worn singlet revealed no tan lines, his skin baked by decades of the Australian sun. His face shielded by little more than a grayed beard, left to grow wild. A small potch might belie his fitness, but I got the sense from him of that wiry strength of a middle-aged man who'd worked hard his whole life. "Oh," was the only response I could think of. The man glanced at me with startling blue eyes. They looked weirdly light against his leathery tan. "I come to look." He answered my question belatedly. He didn't seem dangerous, so carefully I edged even closer. It wasn't a bad place to look, I thought, following his eye line over the quarry. The place seemed so much bigger from here, the hole enormous, opening up right near our feet. Beyond it was a wonderful view of the valley and river. The extent of my intelligent response. I wasn't sure I wanted to say why I was here. It seemed ludicrous to reveal I was following a paper compass. "I'm a little worried about making it back to the train," I found myself saying instead, angling for a way to leave. "I should probably look to find my way back." The man glanced up at me again, then indicated a direction behind me. "There's a path just there that'll take you back to the tracks," he said. "You'd be at the station in 20 minutes. I'll take you back when I'm ready." He patted the ground next to him. It took me a moment to realize he was inviting me to join him. I glanced over my shoulder, looking for this path. I couldn't see it. The bush was too thick. But letting him show me a quick way back was, as the sun dipped lower, A far better way to head home than to stumble through the forest without a path trying to find one. Wary, I lowered myself to sit a short way from him and glanced out at the quarry. Daunted by its size and depth, I looked away and, releasing the compass and folder from the tight clutch I'd had on them, I went to slide the paper back away safely. "Nail," the man said, interrupting me. He didn't extend a hand, but I still took it as an introduction. Maeve," I responded automatically. "Maeve." He nodded slowly as though thinking about my name. "Got the Irish in you, Maeve?" "Oh, well..." Surprised by the question, I had to think about it. I'd gotten that membership to the genealogy site to look up Peter and Mary Malone. So far, my own family tree was just the names of my immediate family. But the family story was that we did have a fair amount of Irish heritage. "Yeah, I guess, if you go back far enough." Neil nodded again, then turned his nod to indicate the paper compass I was slipping away in its folder. "What you got there?" I was a little put off by the abruptly intense stare Neil was treating the compass to. I closed the folder and put the compass back away in my bag. "Something I found." "Round here?" "Down at Pindar Cave," I answered reluctantly. Neil had turned his gaze away. He was back to staring over the quarry. We were both silent for a time, me far too aware of the setting sun. I wished he'd just get up and show me the path home. But from how comfortable he was sitting at the side of the quarry, Neil didn't look to be interested in getting up any time soon. Casting around for some way to stir him from his reverie, I said, "Funny they've just left all the machinery." Neil glanced at me, then down at the machinery I was indicating, left to molder far below on the floor of the quarry. "It's still active," he said. "This quarry. They still cut the stones." "Oh, I didn't know that." Neil nodded a little again. "Oldest active sandstone quarry in Australia," he told me. "Only cut the stones sometimes, though. Now. Makes you wonder what they're looking for." "Looking for?" I said, surprised. What they were looking for seemed pretty obvious to me. "It's a quarry," I went on hesitant. "The stones?" Neil made a small noise. It acknowledged what I'd said, but it didn't sound like he believed me. "Maybe now that's what it is," he said. "They get the odd order for stone and come get it." He indicated the entire valley with a twitch of his head. "But the guy who started this stays all the way out here? What was he after?" "Stone," was my answer. Not thinking Neil would like that answer, I didn't voice it. "Wunderbain sandstone is good," Neil carried on, leaning back on his hands. "But there's lots of places to mine good sandstone in Sydney." Neil sniffed. Suspiciously, it seemed to me. "This place started in the 1880s. They had to get all the workers up here, house 'em, feed 'em, so they could cut the stone by hand, then barge the stone out. That train line, it was supposed to be for the stone, but did it carry much stone? No." Neil answered his own question, not waiting for me to try. "They built the station and rarely ever used it for the stone. They still barge it out." "So, tell me the point of all that," he said, glancing over at me with those startling blue eyes. "Why have a quarry here, rather than somewhere easier to get at? They could do it, but they didn't. That bloke who started it put it here. Why?" I was wondering whether good old Neil, there with me, was a conspiracy theorist. But honestly, I had no good answer to his question. So I shrugged. "You think they were looking for something?" Neil began his slow nodding again, considering as he pondered the quarry. "I think that first bloke was," he said. "Think he had an extra reason to say the quarry should be here. No other good reason for it. Now, I think it's just local pride, for history, you know. Sydney's built by this stone. But back then..." Neil tilted his head, suggesting the bloke back then had an ulterior motive. A noise broke into our conversation. It started with a screech that had me jumping near out of my skin. I spun around, gripping the scrub with terrified fists to stare at the old steam crane. The thing looked rusted beyond operation. As though Neil's suspicions had awakened it, I stared on, confounded as the gears in the crane's trunk started turning. One kicking on the next, the one after being set to turn with it, and the whole thing, like a massive juggernaut of a forgotten era, started moving. A cold wisp breathed out of my mouth as the great pulley on a beam that soared up into the sky started to turn. Old cable rattling over the mechanism, the gears tugged, carrying no load, but churning as though determined to lift something. "Oh," Neil muttered, sounding undisturbed behind me. "The spirits are active tonight. You got 'em going, love." Terrified, I wasn't looking away from the damn ancient steam crane that had suddenly started to work. Work without any steam I could see powering it. I gaped at it, frozen to the dirt, until, with just as much screeching as it had made starting up, it creaked to a halt, the huge gears grinding slower and slower until, the picture of innocence, it just sat there, unmoving, a relic at the edge of the old quarry. "What?" I hissed, my eyes huge in my face, my knuckles white on the mashed grasses I gripped, and that shocking cold tingling down my spine all over again. "Killed a dozen quarry workers over the decades," Neil seemed to answer me as calm as ever. "Them spirits don't care for anyone who searches too close." My eyes still fixed on the terrifying steam crane. It was the sound of Neil getting up that alerted me to a need to leave. "Let's get you back to your train, lass," Neil said, heading toward the bush, barely waiting for me to get over my fright and follow him. "It's getting dark." I scrambled up, made sure the compass was carefully tucked back into my backpack, and gave the crane a wide berth as I hurried after Neil. The path he'd spoken of was less a track, and more an indistinct, narrow gap between trees and scrub. It led down to bare, unprotected train tracks. I'd started my journey trying to avoid those. It seemed, though, the quickest way back to the train platform that was my journey home was trudging along them. I did so, hurrying after the sure-footed Neil, back to the incongruous train station that had been the only sign of the modern world here. It wasn't quite now. Tied to the jetty was a dated speedboat that hadn't been there when I'd alighted from the train. Neil gave me a wave and left me on the platform as he sat by the motor of the speedboat and started the engine. The rapidly diminishing light of the evening glinting off the dark ripples of the river. His speedboat carried him over Mullet Creek, back to, I assumed, his off-the-grid home. When the next train finally approached, I flagged it down with exaggerated waves, taking no chances on the driver seeing me. He did, and the train stopped, me slumping in a train seat in the last carriage, with the journey of the train steadily putting Wandabine and all its mysteries behind me. Feeling safer in the well-lit carriage, I pulled out the paper compass. Just one moment after I'd rested it on its paper folder was all it took for it to spin around, for it to point north, back towards the place I'd just left.